The night was quiet, but the city never truly slept. Streetlights flickered softly along the wide avenues, and the occasional honk of a car broke the calm. For most people, it was just another evening, but for the police patrol moving through these streets, it was anything but ordinary. The officers were alert, walking in pairs, scanning every shadow, every movement. It had been a tense week for the force. Recent incidents had kept everyone on edge, making them hyper-aware of any unusual activity. 2 officers, both in their late 20s, moved along the sidewalk near a government building. They had been assigned to patrol this area regularly, partly because it was a known hotspot for petty crimes, but also because it was close to important offices. The younger of the 2, a man with a sharp gaze and a steady hand, kept his eyes on the street ahead. His partner, slightly taller and more cautious, kept glancing around nervously, hand hovering near his radio. As they moved, a man came into view. He was elderly, walking slowly with the aid of a cane. His movements were deliberate, careful, almost as if he did not want to attract attention. He carried a briefcase in his other hand, gripping it tightly. Something about him made the officers pause, even before he turned to glance in their direction. Perhaps it was the way he walked, measured and careful, or maybe it was simply that he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Either way, the officers instinctively sensed that something was off. "Hey, sir," the taller officer called out, his voice firm but not aggressive. "Can we have a word?" The elderly man stopped, looking at them without fear. His eyes were sharp, intelligent, and calm, revealing nothing of panic. He nodded slightly and waited, clearly willing to speak, but not in a hurry. There was no sudden movement, no suspicious action, yet the officers' training kicked in. Their minds raced with possibilities. "Step aside, please," the younger officer said, taking a careful step closer, his hand brushing against the holster at his side. "We just need to ask a few questions." The man nodded again, raising his free hand slightly in acknowledgement. He didn't reach for anything. There was no sudden motion, no attempt to hide anything. He simply held his briefcase and cane, standing still. Despite his calm demeanor, the officers could feel the tension in the air. Every instinct screamed that they needed to stay alert. As they approached, the man opened his mouth, ready to speak. But before he could, one of the officers asked for identification. The elderly man calmly reached into his coat and pulled out a wallet. His hands were steady, his movements deliberate. He handed over a card, and the younger officer took it, squinting under the dim streetlight to read it. For a moment, everything froze. The name and title on the card seemed impossible. It couldn't be right. The officers stared, disbelief written across their faces. They had expected a citizen, perhaps someone suspicious, but what they saw made them pause. It was a Supreme Court justice, the highest authority in the judicial system, standing right in front of them. The reality hit them like a jolt of electricity. Their hearts raced, adrenaline pumping, but now with a different flavor, a mix of shock, embarrassment, and anxiety. The officer who had first approached the man's side barely knew how to respond. He had trained for tense situations, for encounters that could escalate, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this. The elderly man looked at them quietly, noticing the sudden change in their expressions. He didn't speak immediately, allowing the moment to sink in. He had seen this kind of reaction before, not with police, but in courtrooms, board meetings, and public gatherings. People often reacted when they realized the magnitude of the mistake they had made. Finally, the justice spoke, his voice calm and steady. "Is there a problem, officers?" he asked politely. There was no anger, no sarcasm, only a quiet authority that made the younger officer instinctively straighten his back. One officer swallowed hard, struggling to find the right words. We thought you might be someone else," he said, his voice faltering. He gestured vaguely toward the street, as if the shadows themselves had been suspicious. The elderly man nodded slightly, as though he understood. "I see," he said softly. There was no anger in his tone, only understanding. Mistakes happen. Despite the calm demeanor of the justice, the officers could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on them. They had pointed their guns at a man who had spent a lifetime upholding the law, who had presided over cases that shaped the lives of countless people. And now here he was, standing calmly, assessing them with a patient and measured gaze. Nearby, a few pedestrians had noticed the unusual scene. Some paused, curious, while others quietly stepped back, sensing the tension. The officers felt eyes on them. amplifying the embarrassment they already felt. They had trained for confrontation, for danger, but this was something entirely different. It was a confrontation of awareness, judgment, and humility. The senior officer in the group, a man with more years on the force, stepped forward. He had been observing the exchange quietly, his instincts telling him that the situation needed immediate de-escalation. "Sir, we apologize," he said, his tone formal but sincere. "We acted on a misunderstanding. There is no threat here." The justice nodded, acknowledging the apology without any show of emotion. "Very well," he said, and for a moment the street seemed to hold its breath. The officers, though relieved that the confrontation was ending peacefully, still felt the lingering weight of the near disaster. As the justice slowly walked away, his cane tapping softly against the pavement, the officers watched him go. Each step seemed deliberate, almost regal. The younger officer lowered his gun, feeling the adrenaline fade, replaced by a mixture of relief and shame. He could still feel his heart racing. The senior officer spoke quietly to the pair, trying to ease the tension. "Remember this night," he said. "It's a lesson we won't forget. Always be aware, but never let fear cloud your judgment." The younger officer nodded, still staring after the justice as he disappeared into the night. He could replay the moment endlessly in his mind. The calmness of the elderly man, the weight of his authority, the shock of realization. It was an experience that would shape him forever. For the justice, it was simply another night. He had faced tension and conflict in his career countless times, but this encounter reminded him of human fallibility, even among those tasked with enforcing the law. He continued walking, his thoughts steady, aware that life often delivered lessons in the most unexpected ways. The city street returned to its usual rhythm. Cars passed by, streetlights flickered, and the distant hum of life carried on. But for the officers, this night would linger in memory. A moment where authority, caution, and respect collided in a way they would never forget. They had been reminded that even in the line of duty, humility and awareness were as important as courage and training. The patrol resumed, slower this time, each officer deep in thought. The younger officer glanced at his partner, who gave a small knowing nod. No words were needed. The message was clear. They had learned something profound tonight, in a way that could never be taught in the classroom or training ground. And while the justice moved quietly through the city streets, unaware of the depth of reflection he had inspired, the officers carried the memory of the encounter, a silent lesson that would echo in their minds for years to come. It was a night that began like any other, but ended as a lesson in human judgment, patience, and the unexpected ways life tested both humility and authority. The officers stood on the sidewalk, still shaken by the encounter. The elderly man had walked away with calm dignity, leaving them to process the shock of what had just happened. Their hands still trembled slightly, and each could feel the lingering adrenaline that refused to leave their bodies. The younger officer ran a hand through his hair, trying to steady his thoughts while his partner stared at the street ahead, as if the night itself held answers. The silence between them was heavy, filled only by the distant hum of traffic and the faint chatter of people walking home. For several minutes, neither spoke. It was as if acknowledging what had happened would make it even more real. Eventually, the senior officer broke the quiet, his voice low but firm. "We need to be honest with ourselves. That was a mistake, a serious one." The words hung in the air and the younger officer nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "I can't believe we pointed guns at him. He's a Supreme Court justice." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the mix of fear, guilt, and disbelief. His partner shook his head, still staring at the darkened street. "I keep thinking about it. We were just doing our job, but it feels wrong. It shouldn't have happened like that." The senior officer sighed. "It shouldn't have, but it did. Now we have to deal with it. That means reports, investigations, and maybe disciplinary action. But right now we have to focus. Let's keep moving, finish our patrol, and stay alert." Even as they resumed their walk, the incident played in their minds like a looping film. Every step felt heavy. The man's calm gaze, the way he had handled the situation without raising his voice or showing anger, it was almost surreal. The officers realized that in their fear and suspicion, they had failed to recognize someone who carried authority with grace. It was a lesson they would carry forever, but right now it was also a source of deep anxiety. As they moved along the sidewalk, They noticed that some of the pedestrians who had seen the confrontation were still nearby. A few of them whispered among themselves, casting glances at the officers. Some held phones in their hands, and the officers knew that someone might have recorded the encounter. The thought made their stomachs twist. Social media moved fast, and a simple mistake like theirs could become a viral story before anyone had a chance to explain. "We have to be ready for questions," the senior officer said quietly. "From the department, from the media, maybe even from the public. We have to be honest but careful. No one benefits from exaggeration." The younger officer nodded, swallowing hard. I can't stop thinking about how calm he was. Not a single step out of line, and us. We were ready to act without knowing anything. "That's why training matters," his partner said, finally breaking his silence. "Oh, but it's more than training. It's judgment. We have to think, not just react. Tonight showed that clearly." They walked in silence for a while longer, each officer lost in thought. Their patrol continued, but the energy was different. They were more cautious, more aware of the weight of their responsibilities. Every passerby felt like a puzzle to solve. Every movement under a streetlight a potential test of their judgment. Meanwhile, the elderly man, the Supreme Court Justice, moved steadily through the city streets. He was aware that the encounter could have gone very differently, but he refused to dwell on the near danger. Instead, he thought about human nature, about how fear and assumptions could cloud judgment, even for those trained to protect and serve. He had seen this kind of error before in courtrooms, in political arenas, and in everyday life. People acted quickly without considering the full picture. Tonight had been a vivid reminder. He reached a small cafe that stayed open late, a place he often visited when walking through this part of the city. Sitting by a window, he watched the streetlights reflect off the wet pavement, his cane resting against the chair. He sipped his tea slowly, letting the warmth calm his thoughts. The confrontation had been brief, but it left an impression, not just on him, but on the officers, and perhaps, he hoped, on anyone who learned of the incident later. Back with the police officers, the patrol continued, but now the senior officer suggested a small detour. "Let's check the perimeter of the building. It's routine, but it'll give us time to gather our thoughts, and we might find anything unusual that we missed earlier." As they walked around the building, the tension began to ease slightly. The younger officer adjusted his uniform and checked his equipment, trying to regain a sense of normalcy. "I keep thinking about the briefcase," he said quietly. "We didn't even know what he was carrying, but we assumed the worst." "That's human nature," the senior officer replied. "Fear makes assumptions, but assumptions without facts can be dangerous. Tonight was proof of that." The other officer nodded in agreement. "We were lucky it ended peacefully. It could have gone very differently." "Yes," the senior officer said, "and we need to remember that. Every time we step out there, we're responsible not just for enforcing the law, but for respecting the people we serve. That includes thinking before we act." They continued their patrol, the night stretching on. The city, unaware of the encounter that had just occurred, moved at its usual pace. Cars drove past, street vendors closed up for the night, and the occasional dog barked in the distance. The officers remained vigilant, but there was a new layer to their awareness, a humility born of experience, a recognition that even in positions of authority, mistakes were possible. The senior officer called it a night in his mind when they returned to their patrol car. "Let's document everything," he said. "We need an accurate account of what happened. No shortcuts, no omissions. It's important that the department knows exactly what took place." Back in the car, they began typing out their initial reports. The younger officer's hands shook slightly as he wrote, the memory of the justice's calm eyes lingering in his mind. Every word felt heavy, loaded with responsibility. He described the situation factually, avoiding exaggeration but ensuring the seriousness of the mistake was clear. The partner checked over the report carefully. "We need to include our thought process," he said. "Not just what happened, but why we acted as we did. That transparency is important." As they worked, they realized that this incident would become a story told many times within the department, a lesson for all officers about the balance between caution and judgment. It was rare to encounter someone of such authority in unexpected circumstances, and the near mistake highlighted the fragility of perception under stress. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, the night slowly inching toward dawn. The officers finished their initial reports, but their minds were still occupied by what had occurred. Every street corner, Every shadow seemed to remind them of the lessons learned just hours ago. Meanwhile, the elderly man, having finished his tea, stepped back onto the street. He moved with deliberate ease, his cane tapping softly on the pavement. He thought about the officers, about the pressures of their work, and the instinctive reactions that came from fear and training. He hoped they would take this experience seriously, not with shame, but with reflection. Mistakes could happen to anyone he knew, but learning from them was what truly mattered. The city's sounds began to shift. Early morning traffic started to appear. Shopkeepers began opening their stores, and the air carried a quiet sense of renewal. For the justice, it was another day ahead, filled with responsibilities and decisions. For the officers, it was a night that would linger in memory, a lesson in humility, awareness, and respect. Even as they left the building and returned to routine patrols, a silent understanding settled among them. They had come face to face with authority, not as a symbol of power, but as a reminder of human judgment and restraint. The encounter had tested their instincts, their patience, and their ability to act responsibly under pressure. By the time their shift ended, the first rays of dawn painted the city in soft shades of gold and pink. The younger officer leaned back in the patrol car seat, letting out a long breath. "I'll never forget this night," he admitted quietly. "Nor will I," the partner replied. "It's a lesson we needed, even if we didn't know it at first." The senior officer nodded, looking at the city awakening around them. "Remember this always," he said. "It's not just about enforcing the law. It's about judgment, patience, and understanding. Tonight proved that more than anything." And so, as the city moved into a new day, the events of the night remained etched in memory. A simple encounter on a quiet street had become a profound lesson, shaping the officers' understanding of their role, the weight of authority, and the importance of seeing beyond fear and assumption. It was a night that would never be forgotten, a reminder that in the world of law enforcement, wisdom often mattered as much as courage, and respect for others was a responsibility equal to any badge or uniform. The next morning, the city felt different for the officers. The events of the previous night lingered in their minds like a shadow they could not shake. The younger officer woke early, unable to sleep properly. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see the elderly man's calm face, the steady grip on the briefcase, and the authority in his quiet voice. He had been trained to face danger, to act quickly, but this experience had shown him a different kind of challenge, one of judgment, humility, and patience. At the station, the officers gathered for the morning briefing. Their commander noticed their subdued expressions. "You two look like you've seen ghosts," he said lightly, though his eyes were sharp, catching the tension in their posture. The senior officer stepped forward. "Sir, last night we had an encounter that requires documentation and follow-up. We need guidance on how to handle it." The commander raised an eyebrow. "Go on," the younger officer began carefully. "We were patrolling near the government building. We noticed an elderly man walking with a cane and carrying a briefcase. His behavior seemed unusual, and we approached. In our caution, we drew our weapons." He paused, swallowing hard. It turned out he was a Supreme Court justice. "We pointed our guns at him before realizing who he was. There was no threat, and he remained calm and patient throughout the encounter." The commander's expression remained serious. "I see, and your immediate reaction?" "We were shocked, sir," the younger officer admitted. "We apologized on the spot, but we understand the seriousness of our actions. We're ready to cooperate fully with any review or investigation." The senior officer added, "We also want to learn from this, sir. It's a reminder that assumptions without facts can be dangerous, even with the best intentions." The commander nodded slowly. "You're right. This will be reviewed carefully. Not as punishment only, but as a learning opportunity. Misjudgments happen, but the key is accountability and improvement." After the briefing, the officers were assigned to complete their reports in detail. They sat in the quiet office, typing and reviewing every step of the encounter. The younger officer felt the weight of the words he was writing. Every sentence carried responsibility, every description a reflection of his judgment. Meanwhile, word of the incident had begun to spread quietly through the city. Some pedestrians who had witnessed the scene had discussed it on social media, focusing on the tension of seeing police guns drawn at an elderly man. Speculation was rampant. Some praised the police for vigilance, while others criticized the officers for overreacting. The story had not yet reached the national media, but it was starting to attract attention locally. The officers knew that once the full details were confirmed, it would likely become public. They could anticipate the questions, the judgments, and the debate. But before that happened, they focused on their duties. They patrolled the streets carefully, aware that every action could be scrutinized. Every interaction with the public now carried extra weight. They were determined to demonstrate professionalism, learning from the lessons of the previous night. Later that morning, the Supreme Court Justice began his day. Unlike the officers, his schedule was packed with meetings, case reviews, and decisions that would affect countless people. Yet the memory of the encounter lingered in his mind. He thought about the fear and assumption that had led to the near incident. He reflected on how easily judgment could be clouded, even in trained professionals. It was a stark reminder of human error and the responsibility that came with positions of authority. He also considered the officers themselves. They had acted on instinct, driven by training and concern for safety. Their mistake was serious, but it was not malicious. Understanding that distinction was important. He hoped that any disciplinary actions would also include lessons in judgment, patience, and respect for others. As the day progressed, the police department began its internal review. Supervisors spoke with the officers, asking them to recount the event in detail. They explored every decision, every action, and every thought that had led to the confrontation. The officers were honest, admitting their fears, assumptions, and the lapse in judgment. They emphasized their remorse and their commitment to learning from the experience. Meanwhile, some local media outlets had begun reporting on the story. Headlines hinted at a tense encounter between police and an elderly man, but the identity of the justice was not yet confirmed. Public interest grew, with people speculating about the details. Social media buzzed with opinions, debates, and commentary. The officers read some of the posts, careful to maintain professionalism, but feeling the weight of public scrutiny. The senior officer reflected on the situation. He understood that mistakes were inevitable, but how they were handled defined the officers and the department. Transparency, honesty, and accountability were key. "We need to make sure this doesn't happen again," he said quietly to his team. Training is important, but awareness and judgment matter just as much. As the day moved into evening, the justice returned to his home. He walked slowly, using his cane, but with a calm and steady pace. He thought about the officers again, and about the lessons that life often delivered unexpectedly. He understood that fear and assumption were natural, especially in high-pressure situations, but he also knew that such moments required reflection and humility. Back at the station, the younger officer sat at his desk, reviewing the detailed reports once more. Every word felt heavy. The memory of the drawn guns, the tense faces, and the calm authority of the justice weighed on him. He knew this was a moment that would stay with him forever. The senior officer approached. "It's going to be okay," he said. "We handled the situation the best we could after the fact. We learn from this and we make sure it shapes the way we act in the future." The younger officer nodded slowly. "I hope so. I can't stop thinking about how easily things could have gone wrong. One small misjudgment and it would have been terrible." "Exactly," the senior officer agreed. "And that's why reflection is important. It's not about guilt. It's about learning and improving." The night settled over the city once again, this time quieter, less tense. The officers completed their patrols, returning to the station with a renewed sense of purpose. They understood that vigilance was important, but so was judgment. Every encounter, every decision required both. Meanwhile, the justice continued his routine, dealing with the weight of his responsibilities. Yet he carried with him the memory of the encounter as a reminder of human fallibility. Even those trained to enforce the law could make mistakes, and patience, understanding, and respect were crucial in every interaction. The incident slowly became a topic of discussion within the department. Supervisors used it as a case study, highlighting both the dangers of assumption and the importance of composure. Officers discussed it openly, sharing their thoughts, fears, and reflections. The story served as a lesson, not a shameful moment, but as an opportunity for growth and improvement. For the younger officer, the lesson was clear. Courage alone was not enough. Judgment, humility, and awareness were just as critical. The memory of the justice's calm demeanor reminded him that authority was not always loud or forceful. Sometimes it was quiet, steady, and unshakable, commanding respect without a word. For the senior officer, the incident reinforced the importance of mentorship. Guiding younger officers, helping them navigate both the dangers and the responsibilities of the job was vital. Mistakes were inevitable, but learning from them was the path to becoming better officers and better people. As the day turned to night again, the city carried on, largely unaware of the incident that had unfolded. Yet for those directly involved, the encounter had left a lasting impression. The officers, reflecting on their actions, understood the gravity of the situation and the lessons it offered. The justice, calm and composed, continued his duties with the quiet satisfaction that even small moments could teach profound lessons. And so, the story of that night became more than an incident of mistaken identity. It was a lesson in human judgment, humility, and the delicate balance between vigilance and respect. The officers would carry it with them for the rest of their careers, a reminder that even in high-pressure situations, patience and awareness could prevent mistakes that might otherwise have lasting consequences. The city streets remained busy, filled with life, yet the memory of that encounter lingered silently for those who had been part of it. It was a moment that would not be forgotten, a lesson not just in policing but in humanity, understanding, and the importance of seeing clearly before acting. By the following day, the story of the incident had begun to spread quietly, first within the police department and then into the local media. Though the identity of the elderly man was initially withheld, reports described a tense encounter between police officers and an elderly pedestrian carrying a briefcase. Eyewitnesses recounted the moment the officers drew their weapons, creating an atmosphere of tension that lingered in the minds of those who had seen it. Inside the police department, the internal review was already underway. Supervisors met with the officers involved, carefully documenting each detail of the encounter. The younger officer, still feeling the weight of the previous night, explained his thought process in detail, recounting how fear and instinct had shaped his actions. He described his assumptions, his hesitation, and the moment he realized the gravity of the mistake. "We understand the danger of making assumptions," the senior officer told the supervisors. "We acted as we thought necessary in the moment, but we now recognize how serious the error was." The review was thorough. Every decision, every movement, every step taken by the officers was scrutinized. They were asked why they had drawn their weapons, how they had assessed the situation, and what alternatives they might have considered. The officers answered honestly, showing remorse but also demonstrating their understanding of the lessons to be learned. At the same time, the local media had picked up the story. Early reports emphasized the tension of the encounter and the potential danger, though they lacked details about the identity of the man involved. Headlines read things like, "Police confront elderly pedestrian in government district," or "Tense encounter on city streets, officers draw weapons." Social media buzzed with opinions. Some praised the police for caution and vigilance, while others criticized them for overreacting, calling for better training and awareness. Within the department, there was concern about how the story would affect public perception. The chief of police called for a meeting with key officers. "We need transparency," he said. "People need to know that while mistakes can happen, our officers are committed to learning from them. This isn't about punishment only. It's about improvement." Meanwhile, the Supreme Court justice went about his day, fully aware that the story was beginning to circulate. His calm demeanor did not waver, but he reflected on the broader implications of what had happened. He understood that the officers had acted out of instinct and concern for safety. They had made a mistake, but it was not malicious. What mattered most now was that the situation led to reflection, awareness, and constructive change. As journalists began to investigate, some reached out to sources within the police department. Questions arose about the training officers received for high-pressure encounters, the protocols for identifying individuals, and the methods used to prevent misunderstandings. Within the department, supervisors saw the opportunity to turn the incident into a learning experience. Training programs were reviewed, and discussions began about improving communication, decision-making, and the handling of unusual situations. The officers involved were asked to participate in a panel discussion with senior trainers, The purpose was to share their experience with other officers, emphasizing the importance of careful observation, patience, and judgment. "It's not enough to react," the senior officer told the group. "We have to think, assess, and be aware of the consequences of our actions." That's what this experience taught us. The younger officer spoke as well, his voice steady but thoughtful. "I learned that authority comes in many forms. Sometimes it's quiet, composed, and respectful. Pointing a gun in haste is never the right response. And we have to remember that every action we take matters." These discussions were later summarized into a training module for the department, emphasizing situational awareness, de-escalation techniques, and the careful assessment of any perceived threat. Officers were reminded that fear alone should never drive their decisions, and that respect for every individual, regardless of age or appearance, was paramount. Outside the department, the public reaction was beginning to take shape. Social media posts debated the incident extensively. Some commenters highlighted the potential danger the officers were trying to prevent, noting that their vigilance could have prevented harm. Others focused on the mistake itself, criticizing the overreaction and calling for improved protocols. The conversation grew beyond the immediate event, touching on broader themes of law enforcement, judgment, and human error. The justice, aware of the public interest, issued a measured statement through his office. He praised the officers for their willingness to acknowledge the mistake and emphasized the importance of learning from errors. He reminded the public that while law enforcement officers face challenging situations, mistakes could serve as opportunities for reflection and improvement. His words were calm, thoughtful, and carried authority without anger or accusation. Back in the department, the officers found themselves at the center of attention. They were interviewed by supervisors, consulted by trainers, and asked to participate in discussions about improving procedures. It was an unusual experience, both stressful and enlightening. They had never imagined that a single encounter could have such wide-reaching implications. Yet, they also recognized that it was a chance to contribute positively, ensuring that others could learn from their experience. As days passed, the internal review concluded that while the officers had acted in good faith, their judgment had been flawed. Recommendations were made for additional training, improved protocols for identifying individuals, and enhanced communication methods for high-pressure situations. The officers accepted the findings willingly, grateful that the focus was on learning rather than punishment. Throughout all of this, the justice continued his work without interruption. His daily schedule was demanding, filled with decisions that affected many lives. But he carried the memory of the encounter as a reminder of human nature, both the fallibility and the potential for growth. He often reflected on the officers, recognizing that they were doing their best under difficult circumstances. In his view, the incident was an opportunity to foster understanding and improvement, not blame. At the station, the officers continued their routine, now with a heightened sense of awareness. They approached each interaction with the public more thoughtfully, considering the impact of their actions and the importance of maintaining calm and perspective. Even a minor encounter could carry lessons if handled with care and reflection. The senior officer observed his team closely. He noticed that the younger officer was more careful, more deliberate in his actions, and more reflective in his approach. It was a subtle change, but significant. The experience had left an imprint, shaping how he would approach his work in the future. The younger officer, in turn, thought often about the justice. His calmness, his authority, and his patience were examples of leadership that went beyond the uniformed role of police or the formal position of judge. It was a lesson in respect, humility, and awareness. He carried it with him as he walked the streets, interacted with citizens, and performed his duties. Meanwhile, the public conversation continued. Articles and posts analyzed the encounter, some praising the justice for his composure, others criticizing the officers for their actions. Yet the overarching message that emerged was one of learning and reflection. People recognized that mistakes could happen, even in positions of authority, and that the response to those mistakes, honesty, accountability, and improvement, was what truly mattered. Within the department, discussions about policy changes were underway. Supervisors proposed clearer protocols for identifying individuals, better communication strategies, and enhanced de-escalation training. The officers who had been involved contributed their perspective, emphasizing the importance of thinking before acting and maintaining respect for all citizens. The younger officer realized that this experience would shape not only his career, but his approach to life. It was a reminder that fear and assumption could cloud judgment, and that true professionalism involved patience, awareness, and respect. Even in high-pressure situations, taking a moment to observe and reflect could prevent mistakes with serious consequences. By the end of the week, the incident had moved from immediate attention to a broader lesson within the department. Officers discussed it during training sessions, shared their reflections with peers, and considered how their experiences could help others avoid similar situations. The encounter became more than an isolated mistake. It was a teaching moment, a story that would guide behavior and decision-making for years to come. The justice, quietly continuing his work, knew that his calm reaction had influenced not just the officers involved, but the broader public conversation about authority, judgment, and responsibility. His patience and understanding became a subtle example, demonstrating that respect and composure could transform a tense situation into a lesson for growth and improvement. And so, the story moved from a moment of tension on a city street to a broader conversation about responsibility, reflection, and human judgment. It showed how mistakes, when acknowledged honestly and handled thoughtfully, could lead to change, growth, and understanding. For the officers, the public, and even the justice himself, the encounter became a lasting lesson, one that would shape behavior, decisions, and awareness long into the future. Days turned into weeks, and life for the officers gradually returned to its usual rhythm. But the memory of that night never left them. Every patrol, every interaction with citizens carried the silent weight of the lesson they had learned. It was not just a reminder of human error, but a guide for better judgment, patience, and respect. The younger officer often thought about the justice, recalling the calmness in his eyes, the dignity in his movements, and the quiet authority that commanded respect without a single harsh word. The senior officer noticed the changes in his team. They were more deliberate in their actions, more thoughtful in their approach to the public, and more reflective in decision-making. The younger officer, once quick to react, had learned the importance of observation and assessment. He had realized that even the most trained instincts could be influenced by fear, assumptions, or incomplete information, and sometimes the consequences of a split-second decision could be far-reaching. Within the police department, the lessons from the incident had begun to shape new practices. Training sessions now included case studies of real-life encounters, emphasizing not just procedure but judgment, patience, and awareness. Officers were encouraged to think critically, to assess situations fully, and to consider the human element in every decision. The experience of facing a Supreme Court justice by mistake had become a teaching tool, a reminder that authority and respect often transcended uniforms, badges, and fear. The internal reforms also included new methods for verifying identities in public spaces. Officers were trained to communicate more clearly, to use observation and questioning effectively, and to de-escalate potentially tense situations. Technology was reviewed as well, with updated systems to ensure that individuals in positions of authority could be recognized quickly and safely. It was not about reducing vigilance. It was about enhancing judgment and awareness. Meanwhile, the public conversation continued. Articles and social media posts reflected on the incident, highlighting both the officer's mistake and their willingness to learn. Many people admired the justice for his composure, seeing in his calm reaction a model of leadership and patience. Others used the story as a discussion point for broader issues in law enforcement, emphasizing the need for balance between caution and respect. It became a story about learning, reflection, and the human capacity to grow from errors.